If you're a fan of Cat Stevens, you probably know about his controversial conversion to Islam in the mid-70s. But did you ever wonder what compelled him to make this decision? This is the story of how Cat Stevens became Yusuf Islam. If you like the video, don't forget to give me a thumbs up. And if you want to learn a lot more about Cat Stevens, go to the link in my bio and hit up my Patreon where I made a whole documentary about him. Let's get into it. Oh, baby, baby, it's a wild world. After the release of his second album, Cat Stevens was caught up in living the lifestyle of a young musician. He was drinking to excess, chain smoking, he didn't sleep well, ate poorly, and was generally beginning to deteriorate. He had a persistent cough, and he was quickly losing weight, which prompted the people in his life to convince him to go to a doctor. At first, they assumed it was pneumonia and a collapsed lung, but after a week, they realized it was a little bit more serious than that, and Cat was diagnosed with tuberculosis.
Did you at any time feel that this was a sort of divine retribution for your evil life? I mean, the headlines about Cat Stevens up until then had been Cat Stevens, the man with the fast ladies and fast cars. Did you feel that God was somehow telling you something when you laid you down with TB?
Not really. I think it was more of a natural consequence. I thought that it was nature working its way out. But of course, there was also the other thought that I have to actually somehow find out what this nature is and what it wants from me.
When I reach the end. For 3 months, he sat in a hospital, being subjected to painful treatments. He was depressed, alone, and after this initial treatment period had ended, he was transferred to a caretaking home in the countryside to convalesce. Around this time, his friend gave him a book called The Secret Path by Paul Brunton, a spiritual guidebook that explores the path to inner peace and enlightenment through meditation, self-discovery, and connecting with a higher power. These concepts struck the 21-year-old songwriter, and it was through his understanding of this text that Cat Stevens began his lifelong search for the correct path to take in order to reach a higher power.
And I don't like to abuse his name, you see. I don't like to abuse the word love either. It's one of those things that when I typed it once, you know, and I first saw it coming out, I said, you know, this means I have to go through a deep change. I mean, I have to now open up to the fact, not only just to Jesus, but to the conviction of my lifestyle, which is basically, it's religious. I believe in man as maybe a finger of God.
For the rest of his time at the hospital, he spent his time reading, writing, and learning to properly read music, listening to a combination of Bach and American folk rock bands, retraining his perspective on songwriting. And over the next few months, Cat Stevens would write some of his most prolific and meaningful songs, many of which would appear on his next 3 albums. Thinking about the good things to come. When Cat got out of the hospital, the first thing he did was negotiate his way out of his previous record contract in favor of signing with Island Records, the home of artists like King Crimson and Jethro Tull. He had dozens of songs ready to go for an album at this point, and after spending much of his time in the final months of recovery listening to the band's debut album, Music from Big Pink, he knew exactly the stripped-down folk rock sound that he wanted to accomplish. This album is musically sparse. There are only a few musicians contributing, most of whom Cat had not met before he arrived in the studio to perform with them. This album also gives Cat Stevens a chance to really stretch his vocals like never before, bringing a kind of depth to the music that is otherwise produced in a somewhat poppy way by today's standards.
All of the things that was said about you by a recent reviewer, whatever could be said about your guitar playing and your lyrics, you could never be said to have a voice. Would you agree with that?
I have a fantastic voice.
Mona Bone Jacone was released in April 1970, and it was less than a month later that Cat and the team were back in the studio, recording his follow-up release and what would be considered his breakout album, Tea for the Tillerman, which would be cut, produced, and released all before the end of the year. Between the 2 albums, the difference is this. Mona Bone Jacone is introspective. The songs are personal in the way that they're about his own journey. Lady Darbanville, longing for a distant love and the intensity of infatuation. Popstar reflects on his his pre-TB career, almost mocking himself and his once frivolous goals and attitude towards the music industry.
I'm gonna be a pop star.
And it follows up quite poignantly with I Think I've Seen the Light, which comes in with Cat Stevens pounding on the piano with the fervor of someone who's just figured out the answer to the question that he's been asking. Or at least maybe he's just starting to ask better questions. T for the Tillerman, on the other hand, seems to be more focused on the way that he connected to the outside world. Where do the children play, he asks, making a statement not only about the fraught state that the world had found itself in by the time that the 60s was over, but he asks that we reflect on what our impact is doing to the world around us. Wild World was written for the same girl that he had in mind when he wrote Lady Darbanville. It was originally sort of an end of love song, but it's also deeper than that. It's about leaving home, leaving safety and comfort, going out into an uncertain world. There's a sadness in the leaving, but there's also an undertone of anticipation and even excitement about the bad out there and what lies beyond our current line of sight. After the release of Father and Son as a single, Wild World was issued as a single only in the United States and Canada, and it was the song that Cat Stevens needed to launch him into superstardom in America. And Cat was blown away by this. The song reached number 11 on the US Billboard charts, and he was among the first to bring about this wave of singer-songwriters that would come to dominate the early 70s. Cat's success preceded All Things Must Pass and Tapestry, and would help pave the way for music headed in a different direction than it had been in the 60s.
Trouble, oh, trouble set me.
Composing a song like Trouble takes some serious self-examination and an admission that you've been beaten by life. In Cat's case, literally almost to death. It's a plea to an invisible force, something greater than ourselves, to have mercy on us. It begins with a solitary note fading to nothingness, as if he's sitting alone at the end of his bed with his guitar. There's nothing but silence, but the sound of his voice and some soft strumming. As the song progresses, the other instruments come in slowly and gently, just exactly what was needed and nothing more. And it's at about 1 minute and 42 seconds that the piano returns, and it's sweet, like a little dance of hope twinkling in, surrounding the singer. After the 2-minute mark, the song reaches its peak. And in the last verse, it returns to just Cat making the decision that he's had enough, that it was time to move on. So he asks one last time for the forces beyond him to leave him be, to please be kind, because he didn't have much left. And the shortness of life never seems so real.
Music is, for us, I think, a release now, a spiritual release. For a lot of people, for kids, it's the beginning.
Trouble is Cat Stevens' anthem for survival, considered one of the most beautiful and powerful songs ever written. And it makes one wonder if a near-death experience is what it takes to create art like that. Cat Stevens wondered too. Just prior to him contracting tuberculosis in 1968, Cat Stevens had a lot on the go. One of the projects he'd been working on was a theatrical musical about the Russian Revolution. He wrote a script and titled it Revolutia, and composed a song for the centerpiece. Then he became ill and the project was quickly forgotten, but the song remained. The story revolved around a son who wanted to go and join the revolution, but his father makes an effort to persuade him to stay. It's a classic story in the Divide in Generations, and points out in the most tragically beautiful way the misunderstandings that are often the root cause of the fracture of family bonds. Cat had gone through this himself, of course, when he decided to become a musician instead of carrying on the family business as his father wanted.
Well, I call me Cat because, perhaps because I'm slightly independent from other things or situations that might happen, like today, for instance. I do find myself in this all the time, and it happened all the way through my life, and not only now, but before that in school, I was the same. So I found myself alone. Ask me some nice questions.
Not only did the song represent the way an entire generation felt about their elders, complicated and bittersweet in its nature, but there was something about father and son and the relationship between these two characters, and the language and the tone that pulls out and shines a spotlight on the additional complexities of being born into a family of immigrants. From a modern day perspective, you can take the meaning of the song even further. When it comes to dissecting its poignancy in the discussion of intergenerational trauma and the inherent flaws of the patriarchy, patriarchal system. Inevitably, this system results in unmet expectations and a breakdown in communication. Cat Stevens said he never fully understood his father, but he was always allowed to do what he wanted to do. Father and son, he said, was for those people who weren't able to break loose. Cat's own father, Stavros Georgiou Adams, would pass away in 1978 at 76 years old, just as his son was embarking on his next great spiritual journey.
My father came from an island, Cyprus, where the Turks and the Greeks actually, although they had different backgrounds, were brothers. And of course the influence on each other was gigantic. Cyprus is very close to Palestine, Turkey and Egypt. And in fact my father grew up in Egypt. So Islam was nothing new to him. And on his deathbed was the time when he first called me Yusuf. This is something which is a guidance for me, because I was accepted by my father. He accepted me as Yusuf.
The journey that Cat Stevens went on from falling gravely ill at the beginning of his career to rediscovering his musical identity and embracing a new spiritual path has inspired generations of listeners. Whether it's those introspective moments in Mona Bonjacone, the reflective musings of Tifa the Tillerman, or his later work that intertwine both his faith and music, his legacy continues to shape the landscape of modern singer-songwriters. If you like this look into the life and music of Cat Stevens, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Leave me a comment, let me know your favorite Cat Stevens track, and subscribe for more in-depth explorations of music artists from the 20th century.